Good evening. My name is Lisa Doran, and I'm the Deputy Director for Curatorial Engagement at the Williams College Museum of Art. We're so thrilled to welcome you to our first in-person public program since before the pandemic began. Many of us are still masked, and many are still joining us virtually from far and wide, but we are grateful to be able to gather together in this space. And as we do so, we respectfully acknowledge that Williams College stands on the ancestral homelands of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohicans, who are the indigenous peoples of the region now called Williamstown. Following tremendous hardship after being forced from their valued homelands, they continued as a sovereign tribal nation in Wisconsin, which is where they reside today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. We are truly delighted to welcome back David Arford, guest curator of Strict Beauty Sol LeWitt Prints, for a second lecture in conjunction with the exhibition, which is now on view upstairs through June 12th. In case you missed David's keynote lecture in March, it is available to view on our website, and I encourage you to check it out. As the exhibition itself and the accompanying monograph is full of revelations about the artist and his printmaking practice. And for those who are looking for an in-person deep dive in the galleries, David will be back one final time on Saturday, May 14th at 2 p.m. for a tour of the exhibition. Again, you can find more information about that on our website, and we really hope to see you there. For those who are joining us for the first time, David S. Areford is Professor of Art History at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. In addition to authoring the Strict Beauty Sol LeWitt Prints exhibition catalog, he is also editor of Locating Sol LeWitt, a volume of 9 essays that reveal the full scope of the artist's wide-ranging practice and reassess his singular contributions to 20th century art. In addition, he is the author of articles and books about late medieval European devotional art and printmaking, including The Art of Empathy, The Mother of Sorrows in Northern Renaissance Art and Devotion, The Viewer and the Painted Image in Late Medieval Europe, and Origins of European Printmaking, 15th Century Viewers and Their Public. His current book project is tentatively titled Sol LeWitt Painting. In his lecture this evening, titled Making Walls Speak, Sol LeWitt's Jewish Projects, David is here to share with us his insights into another, even lesser-known aspect of the artist's work. As David will explain, LeWitt's early statements asserting that his work was devoid of the subjective or social or moral purpose might seem to contradict any direct connections to Judaism. Yet, from 1987 to 2005, LeWitt accepted several commissions to make artworks in response to specific Jewish contexts in Italy, Germany, and the United States. We are delighted that this lecture is co-sponsored by the Williams College Art Department and the Jewish Federation of the Berkshires, and on these last few evenings of Passover that we are able to join together to hear this talk. Tonight's presentation will run for about an hour. After David shares his talk, we will turn to a Q&A moderated by WWII's Mellon Curatorial Fellow Destiny Fillmore. We'll have a microphone available for questions from the audience here in the auditorium, and for those joining virtually, you may share your questions for David through the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom navigation bar. If you need any technical assistance, please feel free to send a message through the chat, and our staff team will do their best to support you. Closed captioning is also available and can be turned off using the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. As a reminder to those in the audience, please remember to silence your cell phones. Phew, lots of things to remember for a hybrid program. Now, please join me in welcoming David Arford.
Thank you so much, Lisa. My deepest appreciation to Lisa Doran and to Pam Franks, the director of Williams College Museum of Art, as well as the entire museum staff, all of whom have made possible the exhibition Strict Beauty Sol LeWitt Prints. Thank you also to Lisa Williams and the staff of the New Britain Museum of American Art, the show's first venue and the main lender to the exhibition, Janet Pissell and John Levertu of the LeWitt Collection, and Carol and Sophia LeWitt for all their encouragement and support. Finally, in terms of today's event, I want to acknowledge Destiny Fillmore, the museum's Mellon Curatorial Fellow, along with the co-sponsors, the Williams College Art Department and the Jewish Federation of the Berkshires. Thank you so much. So welcome to the in-person and to our virtual audiences. I look forward to the questions that you ask after my talk. So it's wonderful to be back at Williams to share more of my work on Sol LeWitt. In my March 3rd lecture, I spoke about LeWitt's printmaking and the medium-specific strategies that he employed, strategies that are highlighted in the exhibition upstairs and in the exhibition catalog. Today, I want to consider LeWitt's work more broadly by exploring several of his projects linked to Jewish contexts. And my talk is based on my contribution to the book Locating Sol LeWitt, a collection of essays published in 2021 that grew out of my work on strict beauty and was designed as a forum for current research and diverse scholarly approaches. Taking a cue from the artist's location, wall drawings, prints, and other works on paper, in which he sought to textually describe, spatially position, and visually articulate the placement of lines, points, and geometric figures, the collection of essays aims to situate LeWitt, his conceptual practice, and his artworks in new ways. And the volume includes 8 contributors, including 3 Williams College alumni, Veronica Roberts, Erica De Benedetto, and James Miller. And as the book's editor, I feel compelled to thank Williams and its art history program for producing such outstanding scholars. A search for the Jewish dimensions of Sol LeWitt's art would seem an impossible task, particularly in light of the artist's published statements in which he insisted that his work was devoid of the subjective and any social or moral purpose. By all accounts, the artist was not a religious person. His religious beliefs were never mentioned in interviews, nor was the topic discussed even privately with his children. His wife Carol described him as a very, very observant non-believer, mainly interested in Jewish culture rather than in religious practice. Yet from 1987 to 2005, LeWitt accepted several commissions to make artworks in response to specific Jewish contexts in Germany, Italy, and the United States. And here are the 5 projects. Black Form, a structure made originally in 1987 for the German city of Münster. Wall drawing number 720, created in 1993 for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. A synagogue and wall drawing completed in 2001 in Chester, Connecticut. An untitled brick structure from 2002 at Ostia Antica, the ancient port of Rome. And finally, a temporary 2005 sculpture and sound installation in a former synagogue in Pulheim, just northwest of Cologne. These projects represent, to me, I would argue, the most socially and historically contingent of LeWitt's career, each thoroughly and unabashedly engaged with aspects of Jewish history, memory, and religious belief. And there is no doubt that these commissions are deeply personal, and in some cases overtly religious in nature, allowing the artist to apply his abstract, minimal, and geometric idioms in surprisingly significant ways. Moreover, when interpreted together, the projects offer a new understanding of LeWitt's career-long dialogue with architecture, especially the architectural component of the wall, which becomes more than just a planar sculptural form or a ground for drawing, but also a medium and a subject that expresses a range of historical, textual, metaphorical, and sacred meanings. Now, unfortunately, time doesn't allow me to discuss all 5 projects in detail, so I'll focus only on 3. The best known of LeWitt's Jewish projects is Black Form, dedicated to the missing Jews, a concrete block structure painted black, originally created for a 1987 exhibition of works by 63 artists sited throughout the German city of Münster. And here, along with the installation photograph, I'm showing you the maquette, so you have a better sense of the overall form and the concrete block components. LeWitt's sculpture, which he later referred to as the only political art I ever made, was conceived in response to a specific location suggested by the curators, the cobblestone courtyard in front of the grand 18th century palace, which was built for one of the city's last prince-bishops. Following the exhibition's mandate to engage with the city's history, LeWitt quickly focused on the large pre-war Jewish community, most of whom had immigrated before or during the war, or who had been killed. For the artists, the tragedy of their absence was magnified by the setting of the palace, which was repurposed in 1954 as the principal administrative building of the city's university, its youthful population forever depleted of generations of Jewish students. As curator Klaus Bußmann recalled, LeWitt was thinking about the generation after those who had been killed. Understood in this more expansive way, the Holocaust is an ongoing event, its victims multiplying ad infinitum. As Black Form's parenthetical subtitle indicates, it is meant to function as a memorial. The word dedicated was even mistakenly converted to memorial in several exhibition catalogs in the 1990s and 2000s, resulting in variations of the title, Black Form, Memorial to the Missing Jews, or simply Memorial to the Missing Jews. Yet the traditional idea of a dignified commemoration is countered by the disruptive and oppositional nature of the work's installation. LeWitt told the curator Martin Friedman, "I wanted to make a piece that was completely different from the lacy architecture behind. I wanted it to be hard to swallow in terms of form and completely antithetical to its site." But of course, it was LeWitt's title that clarified the ultimate intention. For him, the title, which was added at the last minute as the exhibition catalog was being finalized, the title made the piece, as LeWitt stated, even more unpalatable, proving his willingness to upset the host city and its local audience, as well as to challenge the critical and historical narrative of his own art, which hitherto resisted such overt political and social meanings. The title's dedication allowed the work to be interpreted as much more than a generic black form. Set directly on the pavement, the large rectangle was perfectly aligned with the palace's central east-west axis, about 100 feet from its entrance, and in the middle of a plaza, once punctuated by another sculpture, a bronze equestrian statue of Kaiser Wilhelm I. Indeed, from a distance, LeWitt's piece might have been mistaken for a plinth awaiting a statue. But closer inspection revealed its dramatic scale, 17 feet wide by nearly 6 feet high and deep. Like a colossal altar with its surfaces charred by sacrificial offerings, its simple materials and austere form, a jarring contrast to the palace's Baroque extravagance, with its huge columns, undulating facade, and pediment decorated with soaring angels, one blowing a golden horn. A highly condensed expression of the many Jewish lives lost, LeWitt's structure simultaneously suggested something solid and empty, giving absence of belligerent weight, as Michael Brinson has put it. As a potential container, it had the appearance of a sarcophagus, or more precisely, based on its size, a tomb or mausoleum, forever sealed and inaccessible. At the official end of its exhibition, LeWitt gave black form to the city of Munster. Remaining in the plaza for 4 additional months, the work was the subject of a divisive debate, pitting its supporters against those who saw it as an annoying obstruction, an eyesore. Ultimately, it was rejected by the university's rector and then demolished in March 1988. But its disappearance was short-lived. The following year, LeWitt remade the piece for a new permanent German home across from the town hall of Altona, a borough of Hamburg. At its dedication, LeWitt donated his honorarium to a foundation for the history of German Jews and declared the piece the most important work that he had ever made. And today it has secured its place in the scholarly literature on public art and memorials as a successful example of a kind of counter-monument by an artist willing to engage uncomfortable aspects of collective trauma and memory. In its new location, black form occupies a prominent place in the urban landscape, along a main north-south axis leading from the train station through a municipal park ending at the town hall. It retains most of the meanings and metaphoric associations suggested by its first location, especially its oppositional relationship to nearby architecture. Since visitors typically approach the work from the north, through the park, its dark horizontal form is immediately set against the white expanse of the neoclassical town hall. The architectonic character of LeWitt's structure has also been heightened due to its larger dimensions, now 18 feet wide by 6.5 feet high, well above the heads of the average viewer. In addition, comparisons to monuments and memorials are even more explicitly referenced, since the statue of Kaiser Wilhelm I stands on a 20-foot high pedestal in front of the town hall. Although these architectural and sculptural connections are relevant, black form asserts more independence in its new location. Not revealed by most published photographs is the fact that it is separated from the town hall by a 4-lane street and set in its own elevated cobblestone plaza, defined by symmetrically arranged benches, flowers, and manicured shrubs. As one circumambulates the work, the park's features, which also include tall trees and an inviting lawn, frame a space conducive to meditation and reflection. Moreover, the piece's memorializing function is reinforced and given a local significance by a nearby plaque bearing the title in English, as well as an extra German dedication, which translates "Monument for the Destroyed Jewish Community of Altona, dedicated to the Jews who will be eternally missed." The signage also includes an overview of the 300-year history of the borough's Jewish population, complete with photographs and a map indicating now lost landmarks, such as a 250-year-old synagogue that was destroyed in 1943. Notwithstanding its relatively tranquil setting, black form continues to be seen as provocative and disruptive. With its larger dimensions, the tall and broad concrete block sides take on the prominence of walls. Their black surface is the perfect ground for the expressive interventions of graffiti, rendered most often in white spray paint, as reported in this 2013 local newspaper story. Although this vandalism sometimes consists of indiscriminate youthful tags and obscene drawings, other markings represent explicit anti-Semitic responses to the structure's meaning, usually in the form of swastikas. Yet most of the graffiti can be classified as left-wing and progressive in nature, the work of people who have no idea about the monument's purpose. For these activists, it is the close proximity to the town hall that makes the structure the perfect posting board for complaints about the government. Thus, I think it's important to acknowledge that LeWitt's only political artwork, as he labeled it, has remained political, although in ever-evolving ways. Indeed, the wall-like sides of black form have accumulated various articulations of personal and political identity on an almost monthly basis since its installation in 1989. And in response, local citizens, including schoolchildren, have intervened each year to restore the work, adding new layers of black paint over the slogans, drawings, and symbols, making these additions, in some cases, forever part of the work. In this way, the structure has inadvertently become a community art project that depends on continual acts of drawing, writing, and painting, acts that have become strangely analogous to LeWitt's practice of employing drafters to produce his wall drawings, which are later deinstalled by painting over them. Of course, by returning the artwork to its original pristine black form, the people of Hamburg, Altona, are reasserting its intended meaning as a Jewish memorial. Perhaps the artist would have appreciated this active, hands-on engagement as clear proof that his piece continues to inspire strong responses, whether positive or negative. Then again, the situation also makes plain the unfortunate degree to which history and memory must be constantly rediscovered, or else too quickly lost. So a decade after creating black form, LeWitt's interest in linking his art to Jewish contexts resulted in a project much closer to home when he was invited to design a new synagogue for his local congregation in Chester, Connecticut. Since this was his first and only venture into true architecture, LeWitt collaborated with the architect Stephen Lloyd, who streamlined the artist's ideas into feasible plans. Dedicated in 2001, the Beth Shalom Radva Zedek Synagogue is generally consistent with LeWitt's linear and geometric minimalist aesthetic. He approached the project, in his words, as a problem of geometric forms in space that conforms to the uses of ritual. The sanctuary is octagonal in shape, with exposed timbers rising over 2 stories high, forming various triangular sections, and finally a hexagon that frames a massive 6-pointed star. Instead of being centered, this wooden matrix, along with the dome-like ceiling square skylight, is dramatically skewed toward the building's east side. This asymmetry directs attention and channels light through the skylight and the 2-level clerestory windows to the bima, the elevated platform used for speeches and the reading of sacred texts, and the Aron Kodesh, or the Holy Ark, the storage cabinet for the Torah scrolls. On one level, the synagogue's clapboarded exterior and post and beam style of timber construction references Chester's local architectural context, which includes several 18th century buildings. But LeWitt was mainly inspired by the traditional building techniques of Eastern Europe, particularly the many wooden synagogues once found there. LeWitt's research of these lost buildings began in the mid-1990s and relied in part on Maria and Kazimierz Petroika's 1959 book, Wooden Synagogues, a compendium of photographs and drawings documenting Polish examples dating from the 17th to the 19th centuries, most of which had been destroyed during World War II. While LeWitt was clearly influenced by the characteristic octagonal plans, multi-tiered roofs, and elaborately faceted cupolas that define the interiors, any decorative flourishes are stripped away in LeWitt's contemporary version. Instead, the building's wooden structural skeleton is exposed, in line with the modernist tenet of truth to materials. Yet the design is not so far in spirit from the synagogues that his parents, who immigrated from Russia, might have known in their youth. Through this subtle referencing and reinventing of a specific Jewish architectural tradition, the Chester Synagogue engages in both preservation and memorialization. In this way, LeWitt extends an aim of the book Wooden Synagogues, as articulated in its introduction. This book commemorates martyred buildings. They deserve to be remembered like the 6 million human beings who perished with them. Thus, the recovery of these structures, whether through scholarship and photographic documentation or the architectural efforts of LeWitt, is about memory, not only of buildings, but also of buildings as stand-ins for those Jews who lost their lives. Although LeWitt's quotations of centuries-old architectural forms are simplified and unadorned, he permits one touch of decorative exuberance, a multicolored 6-pointed star on the Holy Ark's exterior. As geometric figures perfect for serial progressions, stars had long been a part of LeWitt's geometric vocabulary. In this context, of course, the choice of the hexagram has an obvious significance as the Star of David, a Jewish symbol that gained widespread use beginning in the 19th century. Echoing and multiplying the wooden version hovering above, the painted star and its circular frame are composed of concentric bands of pure primary and secondary colors plus gray. The ark's minimalist and seamless design at 7 by 7 feet square is more like a wall than a cabinet, making it the perfect ground for what is essentially a wall drawing, executed in the same bright and opaque acrylic paint typical of many wall drawings of the 1990s and beyond. Significantly, in terms of its formal language, this is the artist's first use of his so-called broken bands, featured in many subsequent wall drawings and prints. Another Star of David hangs directly above the ark, dangling from an antique near Tamid, or eternal light, an indication of God's presence derived from the perpetual flame set before the Ark of the Covenant in the temple in Jerusalem. The lamp and its star add another layer of history and memory to the space. This eternal flame was donated to the synagogue by the family of Melvin Barron, a 19-year-old American soldier who was killed in Rome on June 4th, 1944, the day of the city's liberation by the Allies. Dedicated to one of their own, the lamp forever links the congregation to the events of World War II, not just in terms of Jewish victims, but also Jewish fighters. In the immediate years following the Holocaust, the Star of David was the subject of debate. Used by the Nazis to identify and stigmatize Jews, this symbol was potentially forever tainted, a sign of death and destruction. Yet in 1948, the star was chosen to emblazon the Israeli flag, and it was eventually embraced by Jews worldwide. As Gershom Schlem wrote in 1949, the sign that in our days was sanctified by suffering and torture has won its right to be the sign that will light up the road of construction and life. LeWitt's star seems a perfect illustration of these words, so much so that in 2005 the artist decided to expand its audience by creating a lino-cut version as a fundraiser for the Chester Synagogue. And you can see this print upstairs in the exhibition. With its various titles, temple print, and finally shul print, six-pointed star, the lino-cut returns us to the historical context of LeWitt's architectural models in Eastern Europe. Shul is the Yiddish word for school, referring to the synagogue as a place of study. Temple, on the other hand, suggests that the synagogue is a replacement for the lost temple in Jerusalem, a designation broadly used today by Reform and conservative congregations. Indeed, LeWitt labeled one drawing for the Ark painting project for the temple. Of course, the ancient connection is always signaled by the eternal flame as it illuminates the Ark, the equivalent of the Holy of Holies. The Chester Ark's sacred nature is on full display when one witnesses it in action, that is, as the wall-like doors slide open to reveal the Torah scrolls, each wrapped in mantles of embroidered satin and velvet and capped by silver finials and crowns. Far from the architecturally bound stasis of typical wall drawings, this one moves, or more precisely, it opens and reveals. The colorful Star of David remains constantly visible, split in two as if by pent-up energy, expanding to frame the Ark's contents. In its completely open state, the Ark is a wall overflowing with words, initiating the communal acts of reading and thus sharing the stories of creation, Adam and Eve, Moses, and the covenant between God and humankind. 18 years after creating Black Forum, dedicated to the missing Jews, LeWitt was presented with another opportunity to address the legacy of the Holocaust in Germany. The result was a temporary site-specific installation commissioned for a deconsecrated synagogue in a neighborhood of Pulheim, just northwest of Cologne. This former synagogue is an exhibition venue today with a simple mandate to exhibit one commissioned artwork each year. And as with LeWitt's contribution, the context, both immediate and broadly conceived, is usually a determining factor. Dedicated in 1882, the building is a simple rectangular red brick structure with rounded arches defining its windows, each capped by a floral motif of stained glass. The south exterior entrance wall is punctuated by a Star of David framed by nested brick arches. Purchased by a farmer in 1937, the prominent Jewish star was then covered in stucco, and the space was converted to be used for storage. As a result, the building escaped the widespread destruction of synagogues that occurred in November 1938. Acquired by Pulheim in the late 1970s, it was then restored and reopened in 1983. And the interior that you see on the right still retains two of the basic features required for worship, the raised bema and the Ark, here a refurbished wooden cabinet. LeWitt's installation, which he titled Lost Voices, was straightforward, as detailed in his working drawing and handwritten instructions. It required just two components, a recording of the liturgy for the Jewish High Holy Days, and a brick wall behind which the recording would continuously play. The wall was to be constructed across the interior's entire width, edge to edge, just in front of a balcony at the west end, and it should be built of the same bricks found on the synagogue's exterior. and reach as high as the balcony railing, or just beyond, stopping short of the ceiling. Thus, the brick wall was meant to completely block access, spatially and visually, to about 2/3 of the interior. In its finished form, its dimensions were nearly 15 feet high by 20 feet wide, with a gap of approximately 2 feet at the top. In his description, LeWitt states that the wall presents a barrier which creates a distance that would inspire in part a physical tension for visitors. This tension was felt almost immediately upon entering the building, and here I'm pointing out the entrance so you can understand the layout. After traversing a small foyer, which is under the balcony, one made a right turn toward the sanctuary proper, only to immediately face LeWitt's brick wall. At this point, the balcony's dark brown wooden floorboards served as a low ceiling, just 7.5 feet high. Thus, as defined by the balcony overhead and the brick wall, the initial space felt especially claustrophobic, forcing a heightened physical and psychological reaction. There seemed to be nowhere to go and nothing to see. Only by stepping forward, closer to the wall, did one realize that there was some relief to be gained. Between the balcony and the brick wall, a narrow space opened up to the height of the ceiling, almost 17 feet above. Here, the wall's complete form was revealed, as was the gap that allowed light and sound to spill over its top. Compared to most of LeWitt's structures made from concrete blocks or stones or bricks that assert their independence as pure planar or geometric forms, the brick wall of Lost Voices was never meant to be understood in abstract terms. Instead, its imposing presence was thoroughly integrated into the building structure, not as a seamless addition, but as an obvious obstruction that must be dealt with as a material reality. Built from the same rough red bricks found on the exterior, the wall's surface was highly variable and imperfect, resulting in a strikingly tactile visual encounter. And although generally shrouded in semi-darkness, the wall was directly and indirectly illuminated, primarily by the afternoon sunlight streaming through the entrance door and the window above it. As with the play of natural light over any surface, one became keenly aware of the building's geographical orientation and the passage of time. Yet while the brick wall was unambiguously a wall, its function was far less clear. Architecturally, it made no sense, with the opening at its top and the arbitrary way it bisected the interior. As LeWitt intended, it was more properly a barrier meant to obstruct, enclose, cut off, similar to the improvised walls that sprung up to define the limits of various Jewish ghettos by closing off streets and bricking in windows. As Peter Friese suggests, LeWitt's objective was to prompt a physical experience of confinement, the feeling of being locked in or locked out. The gap between the wall's upper edge and the ceiling suggested potential visual and physical access to the other side, but the wall's height made this impossible. And because the balcony was off limits during the exhibition, a view over the wall was denied. Furthermore, one could not even peek into the sanctuary from the outside, since the 4 large windows are well above eye level. The light and sound-filled space behind the wall could only be imagined. As an aesthetic and sensory experience, Lost Voices relates to other works by LeWitt that employ a strategy of obscuring or otherwise restricting a viewer's ability to see the work in its entirety. Most similar in form and scale is the concrete block structure 6 Walls made for Paula Cooper Gallery in 2000, which consists of large walls 12 feet high by 16 feet wide, enclosing a roughly octagonal volume of space, a space that is physically inaccessible and only partially visible through narrow 6-inch vertical gaps. Some earlier works depend on a complete spatial and visual restriction, as in Serial Project Number 1 ABCD from 1966 and Cubes with Hidden Cubes, this version from 1968. These pieces turn a perceptual game into an intellectual and even philosophical conundrum. Both present series of cubic or rectangular structures, some of which are nested inside each other, and thus completely withheld from view, although clues to their existence are provided. In the case of cubes with hidden cubes, only 5 of the piece's 15 elements are actually visible in the finished work. In an interview in 2000, LeWitt described such artworks in terms of open and closed, inside and outside, in addition to a mix of empirical and theoretical engagement. In his words, you, the viewer, try to figure out the logic and the movement of the piece, and the more you understand it, the more it becomes something coherent and logical to the point where nothing can be changed and everything has to be in its place. Even if you can't see it, it's there. Even if it's not there, it's there in your mind. While ostensibly about logic, LeWitt's commentary hinges on the viewer's trust in the artist and the situation that he has created. Of course, without an experiential method of verification, this trust borders on an acceptance not unlike religious faith. And this analogy seems especially appropriate in the case of Lost Voices, staged in a former place of worship. In addition to the material, spatial, and perceptual aspects of its brick wall, Lost Voices' impact was equally reliant on its musical and textual component. LeWitt selected a full hour of liturgical music consisting of 18 pieces, all sung in Hebrew, from the 2 most important Jewish festivals, Rosh Hashanah, New Year, and Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. These songs played continuously, the sound emanating from the building's far corners behind the wall. Appropriate to the synagogue's history, many of the selections date to the 19th and early 20th centuries. Further, most of the composers were born in Eastern Europe, and several immigrated to the United States. The diversity and undeniable beauty of these a cappella compositions, featuring male and female soloists and choral singing in 4-part harmony, made the work's spatial and perceptual demands more tolerable and also extended the overall temporal experience as visitors lingered in the space to listen to and reflect on the sung prayers of praise and repentance. And I should note that the visitors to the exhibition had access to several of these prayers in English translations in an exhibition brochure. These songs represent the lost voices of LeWitt's title and the particular acts of worship once performed by the synagogue's congregation, as well as the many Jewish communities impacted by the systematic discrimination and murder carried out by the Nazi regime. Although disembodied, the voices implied the presence of actual people trapped behind the wall. This fulfilled LeWitt's stated aim of creating a historic tension to accompany a physical tension that depended on recalling a past that will not return. And this was key to the piece's memorializing function. Yet, like the unavoidable materiality of the brick wall, these voices, with their exquisite melodies and moving lyrics, were insistently present, offering the engaged viewer-hearer, as LeWitt characterized the visitor, many ways to connect, not only with a distant moment in time, but also a deeply personal, emotional, and spiritual here and now. Among the music's persistent themes are judgment and forgiveness. The Hineni prayer speaks of extreme humility before the divine. Behold me of little merit, trembling and afraid, as I stand before you, O gracious God, compassionate and loving, accept my petition and that of my people. Let them not be put to shame because of me, nor I because of them. Sinners though we are, let our prayers come before you innocent and sweet and pleasing, as though from hearts more worthy than ours. Let love be the banner we raise in your sight, and let that love conceal all our sins and make them as they had not been. Change our afflictions to joy and goodness, our misdeeds to acts of life. Although written from a Jewish perspective, the prayer gives voice to the feelings of anyone seeking atonement. Considering the immediate context of a city and country still grappling with a specifically anti-Semitic history, the expressions of communal guilt and pleas for transformative forgiveness potentially contributed to an uncomfortable reckoning for the installation's predominantly non-Jewish German visitors. Moreover, most of the selected songs acknowledge the omnipotent nature of God, sovereign, ruler of the universe, holy and awesome, along with the desire to be in the deity's presence. LeWitt included one of the most cherished standards of synagogue music, the classical setting of Ma Tofu, by the Polish composer Louis Lewandowski, who became the choir master in the Neue Synagogue in Berlin in the 1860s. The prayer expresses a longing for God's presence, as well as for the specifically architectural spaces that contain God and his people. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. And your abundant loving kindness, O God, let me enter your house, reverently to worship in your holy temple. O God, let me enter your house, the place where your glory dwells, so I would worship with humility. I would seek blessing in the presence of God. Confronted with this brick wall and these plaintive yet hopeful entreaties to God, it was impossible not to be reminded of the quintessential Jewish holy site, that is, the Western Wall, the surviving portion of the mammoth limestone retaining structure that once supported the foundations of Jerusalem's Second Temple, destroyed in 70 CE. Quite literally, LeWitt constructed his own Western Wall, situating it at the building's west end. As James Young suggests, Jerusalem's Western Wall evokes the memory of communal catastrophe and mourning, ultimately characteristic of the centrality of memory to Jewish faith, tradition, and identity. The Western Wall is also the focus of intensely demonstrative acts of prayer, with devout visitors chanting and even pressing their hands, heads, mouths, and ears against the stones, suggestive of the wall as a link between the earthly and the divine, the present and the past, as living voices commune with voices beyond the wall. LeWitt visited the Western Wall at least twice, first in 1975 and then again in 1991 when he returned with his wife and two young daughters. Like so many pilgrims before him, the artist left a handwritten prayer tucked between the huge stones, adding his own words, his own voice. LeWitt's brick wall also prompted visitors to leave something behind, at least in terms of a response. This was more than just a mental or perceptual act of engagement, but an emotional and potentially spiritual inquiry, perhaps a prayer for forgiveness or a plea for entrance. Yet this wall was not as accommodating as the sides of Black Form or the exterior of the Chester Ark that allow projection onto their surfaces or that open to reveal the divine word. Although voices linked visitors to the other side, this wall blocked access, creating a distance as LeWitt desired. Interpreted as one of the artist's ultimate statements on walls and architecture, along with his interest in concealment and enclosure, Lost Voices also proved to be a supremely personal commentary on history, memory, and the Holocaust, as well as LeWitt's own religious skepticism as an observant non-believer. In short, it was a work about nothing less than the presence and the absence of God. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was incredibly illuminating and inspiring and awe-inspiring in many ways, and I think it's also left the audience with plenty of questions to ask you. Right. And so I saw a very eager hand. Would you like to ask your question?
Sorry for the preliminary hand raising.
No.
No, that's fine.
So could you just briefly speak a little bit about Sol LeWitt's connection to Jewishness? You mentioned that he was somehow intimately connected to his Jewish identity, but at the same time very secular and perhaps did not believe in God, but maybe just for contextual reasons, do you mind just talking a little bit about through your thoughts on Sol LeWitt's connection to his Jewish identity?
Well, to reiterate some of my framing, Carol, who's behind you, is the one that described him in terms of being a very, very observant non-believer. But this idea of his Jewishness framing his identity wasn't very overt or explicitly expressed by LeWitt himself. So he didn't raise it in interviews, and he wasn't queried about his religious beliefs. So I think he was interested in his Jewish heritage and Jewish culture in general, and these traditions of architecture, which obviously he tapped into for the Chester Synagogue. And this was something that was clearly part of his identity. In the 1978 MoMA retrospective in the catalog, they have a kind of biographical chronology, which mentions that his parents were Jews, Russian Jews, who had immigrated to the United States. And I think his artistic circle obviously was certainly aware of it. And there's certain personal connections that I didn't mention. Black Forum, which ended up in a neighborhood of Hamburg. This has a connection to his dear friend and fellow artist, Eva Hesse, who escaped Europe as part of the Kinder transport, and most of her extended family perished in the Holocaust. So there are certain personal things like that link to these works. Does that help a bit?
Yes, thank you.
But also in the room are, there's at least one art historian here that's made other scholars have made more complex arguments about how his interest in Judaism and Jewish mysticism may have impacted his work as well. So I can lead you to the scholar seated directly behind you for continuation on that. So I mentioned and try to summarize some of that at the beginning of the essay that this is part of.
It brings to mind a question of my own, in particular thinking about the synagogue that LeWitt designed and about the way that he considered movement, especially the internal movement of believers and perhaps his approach to design and how it maybe opted to manipulate that or influence that at all. I'm wondering how that happens in that work, because I see the other two examples that you spoke about, that there's a very purposeful manipulation of one's movement or encounter with an object. And so, in short, how did LeWitt think about the way that believers or folks coming to engage with the synagogue would move through it or around it?
Well, I mentioned in the synagogue, the skylight and this matrix of wood above is skewed so that it's leaning toward, or just skewed toward the east, towards the bima. So it's directing attention, directing the light, but also spatially the experience of the congregation towards that important focus of the space. And I think that he had created a work for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the wall drawing that you see on the lower right, wall drawing 720 in 1993. And if you know that building, which was designed by James Ingo Fried, it has a dramatic skylight with a steel armature that is twisted, so that when you enter the building, the skylight twists so that it points you, kind of dictates your direction as you move through the space and up a staircase that's dramatically situated at an angle to it. Mm-hmm. So I think he was thinking perhaps of that example when he decided this skylight and the matrix of wood would skew towards the bima and the ark. Yeah.
Okay, there's a question coming in virtually. Hello to everyone that's zooming in about whether or not he was actually a member of that synagogue, and I'd add to that how I guess often he would go, if he was, or what his relationship to that space in a physical sense was.
All right, so I can say with confidence that he was a member of the synagogue. Carol, do you want to speak a bit about, and then I can repeat it for the Zoom audience.
Synagogue had a morning minyan on Wednesdays, very early, it's around 8 o'clock in the morning. And he would regularly attend that. And I'm sorry. I thought that one of the comments that you had put up in your quotes was about not being embarrassed, or not being, the idea that people would be shamed. One of the things that he would always say when he was working on the synagogue project is he wanted to build something that was as beautiful as a congregational church, because he did not want the Jews to be slighted in the community by building something that was not elegant. Very interesting. He actually traveled around the world and looked at synagogues. He did hundreds of drawings for the project. So he took it very, very seriously.
Yeah, I really appreciate, and I tried to stress that his interest in tapping into a Jewish architectural tradition and creating something, as you said, that was distinctive, that would be distinctive in the community and stand on its own as an architectural statement is really important. And he grew up, of course, and attended synagogues that had appropriated buildings that had been used. One was a Lutheran church that was like a basilica, basically a kind of New England Gothic style basilica. And then the second synagogue that he attended when he was a teenager was a Masonic temple that was very classically designed with Doric columns on the outside and the inside. So I really love the fact that the Chester Synagogue is something that purely comes out of an architectural tradition that's identifiable as a Jewish one.
And there's one more follow-up question on the Star of David that you pictured in the synagogue. Did it precede the one that's at Masmoka? It's being asked online.
So there is one Star of David at Masmoka. It's part, I think, of wall drawing 396, and this is one way that I think this project, or this research on the Jewish projects and bringing them together and kind of lining them up and see how they're connected, makes us look at other things differently. So that particular wall drawing is in the primary colors in black, and it's stars, and the way he used them as serial progressions is their points. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They were just a perfect way to use stars as a serial subject. But this particular wall drawing, the 6-pointed star is yellow. And so now when I look at that, and maybe this is what the questioner is thinking of, it's hard not to see that as the yellow Star of David, even more direct kind of quotation and reference to the Nazis in World War II.
Well, while we're on the subject of wall drawings, I'm very interested in this idea of preservation that you've teased throughout this talk, in the very literal sense. The preservation of wall drawings, I imagine, is quite complex because their application is, and it seems to sort of attest to this care and engagement with memory that LeWitt was interested in throughout his career. So could you speak to the efforts for preservation at large for the wall drawings, and maybe if there were something or other details from Black Form that you didn't get to cover? I'd be really interested in knowing.
Yeah, I think the damage that is done to Black Form on an almost monthly basis, as I suggested, does bring up these issues of preservation for these public installation of LeWitt's work. And based on what I know, LeWitt was concerned about that. He wanted works to be as pristine as possible and to remain in that state, whether it's a structure made of concrete blocks or a wall drawing. So, for instance, with the wall drawings, this led to the use of a spray varnish over the surface so that they wouldn't be smudged. Now, with the concrete block works, he's purposely chosen a mass-produced, fairly porous block that's not used for finishing usually. So these sometimes have to be reconstructed and reinstalled. But because I've seen many examples, there's one outside the Birmingham Museum of Art that's absorbed a lot of pollution and it's discolored. There's another in the Sculpture Garden at the National Gallery of Art in Washington where they've repaired blocks that have been damaged. So they've carefully repaired them so it retains this pristine state. So of course I asked these questions: what would LeWitt have thought of the graffiti on Black Form and the repainting of it? I like to think that he would at least be positive about the repainting, the desire to return it to its original state. But I am curious whether the way it provokes this interaction constantly from different activists and different political points of view, and he considered this really the only political art he ever made. I think it's kind of wonderful the way it still is a kind of posting board for political ideas.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it seems that provocation, or rather discomfort, is are words that might be synonymous with one's engagement with the memorial, especially in moments such as these, where there are these social reckonings happening throughout various societies. And so I'm curious, with LeWitt's, as you said, his desire to, may I quote directly, his willingness to upset the host country, the host city, and its local audience. If that intentional, I won't say provocation, but if the space that was allowed by being very intentional about the capacity to upset the people of the city of Munster, if that at all might sway or form your opinion when you think about how he would have reacted to the graffiti.
Yeah, I think you're answering my question.
Oh.
Right, I mean, in that, right, so since he felt that it was such a disruptive work, and it was so pointed in what it wanted to communicate, that perhaps these things that perhaps he couldn't have predicted fit in with his approach to it still being disruptive. That makes perfect sense to me. I know after the experience in Germany, especially when the piece was demolished initially, and then he found a new home for it, I don't think it was such a pleasant experience for him overall. But the experience of creating public memorials and monuments is fraught with tensions. It's it's got to be a communal and collaborative engagement, and it doesn't always work out. And when he decided to do the wall drawing 720 on the lower right at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, it was a much more controlled situation, because the building itself is designed to be the memorial. Its architectural language, which is very metaphorical, the skylight that I mentioned, the way it really frames your experience of the exhibitions. So he knew that his piece would be not the subject of graffiti. It would be protected inside the museum. He wouldn't have to deal with these particular issues. It would be a much more controlled environment.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Oh, I want to pause it and leave any space if there's any questions coming from the audience, because I know that we can keep going. Okay, because there's...
I have a comment.
Oh, yes, please.
Comment/questions.
All right.
First of all, the header for my observation in the last synagogue you spoke about is that nothing that Sol did was arbitrary. He planned. Please. He planned everything. I don't know whether that included the weather, but he planned everything. And I was noticing when you were showing the drawing that he had sent to the person who was working with him on, that the elevation view shows a square, such that that indicates to me that he was creating a cube within that rectangular space. So, and that the sound and the light held the wall up rather than the wall dividing the space.
So that idea of creating so I don't know if the virtual audience heard all of that, but the way in which Lost Voices was designed, the way he divided up the space, creating, you're saying, a cubic volume of space behind the wall, which fits in with his interest in the cube and the square. And that idea of the sound as a presence holding up the wall.
And the light was holding up, even though it was passing over, it was holding up the other side.
No, I think those are really interesting ideas. I mean, that piece is, of course, it was a temporary installation, and I did not get to experience this piece. So a lot of what I was trying to do there is recreate what the experience must have been like spatially. But that idea of walking into that building and being underneath the balcony, which is just 7 feet or so above your head, so it's pressing down on you, these dark boards, and then all you see is this wall that's closing up the space. And this sensation of walking forward and seeing the light spilling over the top and realizing there's an opening up. So it's all very enticing because you hear the sound that's spilling over the top, you see light spilling over it, you're encountering the surface of the wall, and yet you realize it's edge to edge. It's totally closed off access.
The sound is coming over.
Yes, yeah.
So it's the entire building interior is equalized
Through the sound.
through the sound and the light, even though you can't see the light on the other side.
Right, you can't experience the space physically.
But there's something,
I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about LeWitt. Thank you. I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about LeWitt's titling process, just because we're so familiar with his wall drawings, wall drawing 1098's upstairs, and black form, and especially its parenthetical subtitle, sort of marks a very distinct sort of label, for me at least, from his other pieces. And I think just titling has kind of a fraught relationship with abstraction in general. So if you could speak a little bit on that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, so I think from your question, you seem to know that, of course, LeWitt avoided such titles, usually. Sometimes the titles are simply they're descriptive of the formal language. They may be a kind of stand-in for instructions for creating the work. So he created that kind of title after the number for the wall drawings, for instance. But here, Lost Voices, unusual because it's so poetic and so direct in terms of what it's trying to do. For wall drawing number 720 in Washington, it has a title, it's 720 Consequence is the title that he settled on, which is an interesting word because it speaks to the sequence of gray squares and colored squares framing them, but also within the context of the museum and the exhibition, the wall drawing is in a space that's transitional. It's right after the part of the exhibition about the final solution, the ghettos, the concentration camps, and then you enter into this space, and there's a bench that you can sit on, so you can take a pause and to reflect on what you've seen and learned before you go into the final third part of the exhibition, which is about the aftermath of the Holocaust. So there, the idea of consequence, of cause and effect, of Nazi anti-Semitic Semitism, and or the idea of something coming after the ramifications of the final solution. So there, I think he's interested in those kinds of connections or meanings or interpretations. But then again, for the piece on the lower left, which I wasn't able to talk about, this is the piece he made for Rome's ancient port city, Ostia Antica, and it's on the site of the oldest synagogue in Europe. It dates to the earliest foundation, so the 1st century, and then it was added to in the 4th century. And that's what you see in the background of that image. And his piece is this circular wall, but it's untitled. But within the context of the installation, which is a permanent one, he's actually rebuilding the most important part of the synagogue, this apse that held the Holy Ark, which was a cabinet with doors that opened within it. So it's in a ruined state in the distance. You can still visit and walk into that space. But here he's created this abstracted version that makes it complete again. There, no title. So he's resisted giving it a title. But just it's up to you to make this spatial connection walking around the site and then to realize what he's done.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I believe that was the last question that we had time for. But again, want to just thank you for your phenomenal presentation and all the responses to the questions that you were offered tonight.
Thank you.
Do you have any closing remarks that you'd like to share with the audience?
That's it. Thank you to everyone. Thank you very much.